The telegram hit the floor of the Stanford dormitory, a stark white rectangle against the polished wood. Azim Premji, 21, stared at the ink. His father, M.H. Premji, was dead. He packed his bags in silence, leaving his engineering textbooks open on the desk. 48 hours later, the humid air of Bombay clung to his skin as he stepped off the plane. The transition from the quiet of the library to the frantic pulse of the city was jarring. He walked into the headquarters of Western Indian Vegetable Products Limited. The boardroom smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. The chairman pushed a ledger toward him. "The oil production is steady, boy," the chairman said. "Just sign the reports and stay out of the way." Azim looked at the ledger, then at the men. He did not sign. Azim pushed the ledger back across the mahogany surface. The heavy book slid, hitting the edge of the table with a dull thud that echoed in the quiet room. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked toward the door without looking back. The board members remained motionless, their surprise turning into a cold, simmering resentment. The next morning, the city was still dark when Azim reached the factory gates. At 5 a.m., the air was thick with the scent of raw hydrogenated oils. He moved past the security desk, blending into the early shift of workers. He stood by the main vat, watching the rhythmic clatter of the pistons. He tracked the temperature gauges, noting the slight fluctuations that caused the oil to thicken. He approached a floor manager, pointing to a valve that hissed with wasted steam. He asked about the supply source, his voice steady and precise. The workers watched him, expecting a wealthy heir to complain about the heat or the grease. Instead, he stayed. He watched. He listened. By the time the sun climbed over the factory roof, he had memorized the cycle of every machine on the line. When the factory lights dimmed, Azim moved to the administrative wing. The office was a labyrinth of locked cabinets and dusty files. He spent his nights under the flicker of a single desk lamp, mapping supply chains that had remained untouched for a decade. He tracked every rupee, every shipment, and every wasted batch of oil. When he requested the master accounts, the board members blocked his access. He did not argue. He bypassed their authority entirely, digging through archived logs and cross-referencing shipping manifests. The patterns were undeniable. He found massive inefficiencies buried in the company's core operations. He compiled his findings into a thick, precise audit. The next morning, he walked into the boardroom and dropped the report onto the mahogany table. The sound was sharp, final. He looked at the shareholders. As he flipped through the pages, he pointed to the gaps in production and the inflated costs of raw materials. The power dynamic shifted in the room. The men now sat in silence, staring at the hard, unyielding data. He had turned the tide. The board members exchanged glances. Then a low, dismissive laughter rippled around the table. One man leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are a student playing with toys, Azim. Stick to the oil." Azim did not blink. He did not defend his logic. He simply turned and walked out, leaving their laughter behind. He moved his focus to the factory lab, a cramped space filled with beakers and raw chemical samples. He ignored the standard production protocols. He spent his days measuring fats and lye, adjusting the heat, and stirring mixtures until his arms ached. He was looking for a specific texture, a balance that felt right to the touch. He tested each batch, scraping the hardened soap from the molds. If it cracked, he threw it out. If it was too soft, he started over. He spent hours under the harsh fluorescent lights, his hands stained with residue. He was no longer a student. He was a craftsman, and he was ready to prove that the board was wrong. The first shipment of soap reached the local markets on a Tuesday. By Friday, the shelves were bare. Azim monitored the sales logs, watching the numbers climb until the inventory hit zero. He did not celebrate. He took the ledger, marked the profit margins in bold ink, and walked back into the boardroom. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of tobacco. The chairman looked up, his expression guarded. Azim did not wait for an invitation to speak. He stepped to the center of the table and slammed the ledger down. The sound echoed against the wood, cutting through the murmurs of the men. He pointed to the final column, where the margins proved the success. The room went silent. The laughter that had filled this space weeks ago was gone, replaced by the scratching of pens. He did not ask for their approval. He simply stated the next steps for the company. The power had shifted. The pivot was not a transition. It was a demolition. Azim began dismantling the old machinery, replacing the heavy oil vats with rows of computing hardware. The backlash was immediate. Legal notices arrived daily, thick envelopes stacked on his desk, threatening to tie the company in court for years. He ignored the lawyers and focused on the engineers. Inside the office, the air turned heavy with tension. Files went missing. Server configurations were wiped overnight. He found the internal sabotage in the erratic code logs and the disconnected power lines. He did not call the board. He stayed in the building, sleeping on a cot in the server room to monitor the systems himself. He faced down the lawsuits in courtrooms, his voice steady as he defended the shift to software services. Every day brought a new crisis, a new attempt to stall the progress, and a new threat of bankruptcy looming over the payroll. He moved through the chaos with a cold, singular focus, firing those who slowed the momentum and recruiting those who understood the logic of the digital age. The company was bleeding capital, but he refused to stop the migration. The accounts hit zero on a Tuesday. Suppliers stopped shipments. The banks sent final notices, their ink sharp and final. Bankruptcy was no longer a threat. It was a deadline. Azim sat in his office, the silence of the building pressing against the glass. Then, the alarms sounded. A primary server rack had overheated, and the cooling system had seized. He ran down the stairs, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. He reached the factory floor to find the technicians standing back, watching the smoke rise from the hardware. The line was dead. The pressure was absolute. He did not yell. He did not look for someone to blame. He shoved past the line, grabbed a wrench from the workbench, and knelt in the grease. He pulled the casing off the main unit, his fingers moving with precision despite the heat. He bypassed the failed relay, rewired the connection, and held the contact point steady with his own hands. The machine stuttered, groaned, and then hummed to life. He stayed there, crouched in the dark, watching the lights flicker back across the console. The recovery was not immediate, but it was absolute. The software systems held, and the first major contract arrived, signed by a client who cared nothing for vegetable oil. The board members, once vocal in their derision, retreated into the shadows. Azim watched the numbers shift on his monitor, the red ink of bankruptcy replaced by the steady black of profit. He did not celebrate. He expanded. He replaced the last of the outdated equipment, clearing the floor of the heavy vats to make room for rows of new, humming servers. The transformation was complete. The company that once produced oil was now a powerhouse of global technology. He had taken the capital they deemed lost and turned it into an empire of code. The men who had called him a student now sat in silence. He had proven his vision against the weight of their tradition, dismantling their failure to build a future they had never dared to imagine. The Titan had arrived, and the old order was gone. The boy they had tried to dismiss had become the architect of a new world. The office was quiet, a stark contrast to the rhythmic clatter of the factory floor that had defined his early years. Azim stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass, his palms pressed against the cool surface. Below him, the city stretched toward the horizon, a sprawling grid of lights and steel that had been fundamentally reshaped by his decisions. He traced the skyline with his gaze, identifying the landmarks that now housed his servers and his teams. The weight of the past, the stale tobacco of the old boardroom, the cold doubt of the men who had once sat in judgment, felt like a lifetime away. The grease of the machines he had repaired by hand felt like a lifetime away. He turned from the window. The desk was clear, save for a single terminal and a telephone. He did not look back at the history he had dismantled. Instead, he reached for the receiver. The next market was already waiting. The next technology was already in development. He dialed the number, his movements precise and unhurried. He was not finished. The transformation he had started was not a destination, but a process that demanded constant movement. As the call connected, he looked out at the city once more. his focus shifting from what had been achieved to what was yet to be built. He spoke into the phone, his voice steady and low.